humanitarian principles, what we call the core humanitarian principles guiding humanitarian action, are four. It's humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And I will get into more details on this in a minute, but I wanted to highlight an important difference between the fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and the humanitarian principles. The fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent are 7. They were adopted in 1965, I will get back to it, and they deeply influenced the rest of the humanitarian sector, and indeed they were adopted later on as those 4 principles guiding humanitarian action. The difference is that we have those 3 additional principles within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement that are voluntary service, unity, and universality. And I will get back to this in a second. But before that, a few words about the origin of the principles. Those humanitarian principles were, first appeared in substance on the battlefield of Solferino in 1859, which, as you know, marks the origin and the creation of the Red Cross, and later on the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, when Henri Dunant, arriving on the battlefield of Solferino, seeing like more than tens of thousands of people, of soldiers wounded on the battlefield, decided to mobilize people in the surrounding villages in this area of northern Italy to come to the help of the wounded soldiers, and to do that without any discrimination, regardless of the side of the soldiers, and that's the very origin of this very important principle of impartiality, which in essence is about non-discrimination in the way we provide relief. It's only more than 1 century later, really, that those principles were formalized as we know them today. In 1965, at the 20th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement held in Vienna, the 7 fundamental principles of the Red Cross that I have mentioned before were formally adopted. However, they didn't come out of the blue all of a sudden in 1965. As I said, they first appeared somehow on the battlefield of Solferino, but they were also the crystallization of 1 century of operational practice, of field experience of the ICRC and the broader Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Afterward, in 1991, through UN General Assembly Resolution 46182, those principles, the first 4 principles of humanity, the first 3 principles actually of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality were consecrated or recognized in this resolution of the UN General Assembly as the principles that should guide humanitarian action. And in 2003, through Resolution 114, the principles of independence was added to those 3 principles that were first recognized in 1991. And throughout the 1990s and then later in the 2000s, those principles were increasingly recognized and embraced by the broader humanitarian sector, NGOs, UN, through the adoption of a number of codes of conduct, NGO charters that embedded those humanitarian principles in the policy and practice of humanitarian actors. And to mention but one, I can mention the Code of Conduct for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and NGOs in disaster relief, which is signed by more than 500 non-governmental organizations, which really embed those principles, those 4 humanitarian principles. And in the 2000s, a number of regional organizations have also recognized those principles in their own policy documents, such as the European Consensus on Humanitarian Aid, which was adopted in 2008, the ECOWAS humanitarian policy that was adopted a few years back that also recognized the importance of those principles, and so on and so forth. I could mention some others, but those are 2 that illustrate my point. Let's get to the definition of these principles. First, I like to when introducing the principles to show this pyramid that represents the 7 fundamental principles of the Red Cross, and not only the 4 core humanitarian principles as we know them, because that's the way we understand these principles within the movement. And we like to represent them through this pyramid because it gives it reflects this notion of hierarchy within the principles. All the principles are not do not have the same finality. All the principles do not have the same value, even though they are deeply interlinked and they should be used as a whole. And basically, I will stand up here. Humanity and impartiality were described by Jean Pictet, whom you know well because of the work he did on the commentaries of the Geneva Conventions. Jean Pictet also commented those principles of the Red Cross, and he said that humanity and impartiality are what he called substantive principles, meaning they belong to the domain to the realm of goals. This is the very essence of humanitarian action. This is what we aim for. Then neutrality and independence have a different character. They are tools, they are operational tools for action that enable impartial humanitarian action, which is our goal. And then those 3 principles of voluntary service, unity, and universality that are unique to the movement, the way they are at least understood within the movement, are institutional in character. They provide the institutional foundations within the movement to enable the application of the other principles. Just one example is unity. The way we understand unity within the movement is that there should be one national society per country. It should be open to all, and it should cover the entirety of the territory. And this is not the condition, but it certainly facilitates, enable national societies to deliver impartial aid throughout the territory. And by reflecting the diversity of a population, ethnic, religious, cultural, social, it also arguably enabled them to remain neutral or perceived as neutral should the situation deteriorate and the conflict break out in a given country. Now, let's get to each principle relatively briefly, but still. Humanity, the essential principle of humanitarian action. It's really it sets the purpose, the sole purpose of humanitarian action, which is to prevent and alleviate suffering of people affected by humanitarian crises, but also to protect life and ensure respect for human dignity. There are 3 important aspects that can be drawn from it. First, humanity represents a deep belief in the sacredness of human life and the equality of human beings. So a corollary of this principle is the idea of non-discrimination that I have already mentioned in reference to Solferino. Then in our understanding of the principle of humanity within at least the ICRC, it requires to work really in proximity with the people we are serving, with the people affected by crisis, and to develop a human relationship with them, because it's more than delivering just assistance. It's indeed about respecting their dignity, therefore having this human relationship with them, being able to listen to their concerns, to understand their situation, and to try to bring a response that is adapted, but also culturally adapted. And then the last important point is that humanitarian action encompasses not only assistance, material assistance, health, food, shelter, but also production activities, ensuring that people's rights under IHL, under international human rights law, refugee law, and so on and so forth, is respected. Impartiality. As I said, impartiality is still a substantive principle. It still belongs to the domain of goals, and it's kind of corollary to the principle of humanity. Indeed, this idea of non-discrimination, which is one of the components of the principle of impartiality, is key and is an integral part of this ideal of humanity. And non-discrimination means to make sure that relief action will be given, delivered, regardless of the political sympathies of people, regardless of their race, of the side they belong to, their religion, their gender, and so on and so forth. And aid should be based only on needs, on an objective assessment of needs, which is this principle of proportionality. It should be delivered based on the urgency and the severity of needs. And then a third component of impartiality is the exclusion of personal bias. It means that as an individual relief worker, you have to put aside maybe your personal feeling toward one individual because he's a member of your family, is your cousin, or because he's part of your same ethnic group, but really try to address the needs only based on the proportionality of the needs and without any other discrimination. Then we get in the domain of means to an end, operational tools, neutrality. The way neutrality is defined within the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, it starts with this phrase, in order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all. So here we see that neutrality is almost utilitarian. The finality is to gain the trust of people, the confidence of people that enable us to deliver impartial humanitarian aid. It has two main aspects. One is military neutrality, which is not taking side in hostilities, but also making sure that the aid we provide doesn't support, even inadvertently, as much as possible, any parties to a conflict. And then there is the notion of the aspect of ideological and religious neutrality, which is to abstain to engage in controversies of religious, political nature, to make sure that we do not antagonize any side, but also any segment of the population, in order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all and to enable us to work on the field in proximity with the people. And the corollary to neutrality is independence. And independence is about maintaining the autonomy from any parties to any third party in a given conflict, the political, economic, or military interest of any party in a given conflict. That includes, in the ICRC practice and in the Red Cross Red Crescent practice, to maintain some autonomy from the United Nations, for instance, in some context where the United Nations are deeply politically involved, given the mandate given by the UN Security Council, for instance. It involves maintaining some autonomy from our donors, institutional donors, states, and that result in our insistence, for instance, to get non-earmarked, earmarked funding, so that we remain autonomous in the way we direct the assistance and protection that we deliver. I realize that time is running, so I will try to move on a bit more quickly to the function of the principle, the finality of those principles. As I mentioned, those humanitarian principles provide both an ethical and an operational framework for humanitarian action. Humanity and impartiality provide this moral compass, whereas neutrality and independence are really about enabling us in the field, given the actual circumstances we operate in, and given the politics of the situations in which we work, to navigate those complexities and to deliver this impartial aid. And indeed, the neutrality and independence, as mentioned before, are really made to ensure acceptance by all. And this is the foundation for this acceptance-based access and approach to humanitarian action, by working on the perception of people, by ensuring that we are seen and perceived as neutral and independent from any political or economic stakes. We ensure the acceptance of the authorities, of arms carriers, of the communities themselves, which itself is necessary to gain access, not always enough, but certainly a precondition to get access, and that enable action that is relevant to the people. So by working in proximity with the people, which is itself by making sure the aid and the programs that we deliver are relevant to the people, it affects also positively the perception, and then you have this kind of virtuous circle. And for this, dialogue is critical. And dialogue with all parties concerned, including non-state armed groups. And for this, it is important that in the first place, we are seen as neutral and independent to have access to those different armed groups, being governmental, non-governmental. And also, I mean, but this ability to have dialogue can be affected by, for instance, counterterrorism measures or policies that would restrict the ability of humanitarian organizations to have a dialogue and to engage with those different groups.